Colorado got absolutely embarrassed by Washington State on Friday night. And we've made the joke all season long about how this offensive line was going to get Shedeur Sanders injured. Well, it no longer is a joke anymore, people, because it actually happened. Shedeur Sanders in the first quarter alone was sacked 4 or 5 times in this game, and it didn't take him long for him to get injured. He ended up getting hit on a big play, which resulted in a strip sack that resulted in a touchdown. And this same dude, number 80 for Washington State, also ran back another play that happened in similar fashion later on in this game. And once Shedeur Sanders went down, you knew this game was over. Okay? And without Shedeur Sanders, Colorado probably will only have 1 win at best this season. You know, he's been the heart and soul of this team. He's been the glue that has kept this team from being worse than what it has been since they started out 3-0. And you would have expected for Colorado to have a much more competitive game against a Washington State team that, just like you, started out really hot. They were unbeaten at one point, and then they completely fell off the cliff. Washington State just looked like a superiorly more talented team than Colorado, even though they weren't, and they just looked better coached. Kermani McClain, he was getting cooked out there. Travis Hunter, he had a little bit of a shaky performance as well. This just was a terrible performance by Colorado. All right, this offensive line got Shedeur Sanders injured, and it no longer is a running joke anymore. It actually happened. This season, for me, has kind of been a little bit disappointing. Although Deion Sanders has exceeded expectations, he won 4 games as opposed to them only winning 1 game last year. But it just could have been more, if you get my drift. They started out with so much hype once they started out 3-0 because they overexceeded expectations. And then people recalibrated their expectations. Then they played Oregon. And when Dan Lanning said that the Cinderella story is over, he meant that shit. Because when Oregon annihilated and clobbered Colorado, they only won 1 game since that loss. Like, the Cinderella story was truly over. Dan Lanning and the Ducks truly ended the Cinderella run that Colorado was on. And I asked you guys the other day to grade Deion Sanders' first season at Colorado, and the majority of you guys are giving him a C. Which I probably will give him a C also, because I wanted to give him a B or a B+, because they did start it out 3-0. They got a big win on the road against TCU. I don't care how bad TCU is. They get a big-time win on the road in week 1 in that kind of environment when you were a 3-point touchdown underdog is huge. The fact that you started out 3-0, you pretty much already tripled your win total in your first 3 games was huge, and you exceeded expectations. And at that time, Deion Sanders looked like he could do no wrong. But then after that, and the more you watch Colorado, and I've watched pretty much every single Colorado game this year, you start to realize Deion's flaws. And you see, coming in to this season, I thought that Colorado would at least be a 6-win team. I understood that the realistic expectations were 3 to 4 wins, which I was understanding of. But I thought that Deion Sanders was a better coach than what he actually has proven to be this season. He's not a bad coach. He's not a garbage coach, but he definitely has a lot of learning to do and a lot of growth that he has to make as a head coach himself. I feel like he did a bad job of being able to manage this team when a lot of people were saying nothing but good things about them and their performance and the fact that they're 3-0. And it's a difference between coaching a team that doesn't have a lot of expectations and that's playing games to prove people wrong versus coaching a team that has all this praise from the media and now people are expecting things out of you. He did a bad job of being able to handle the hype that Colorado got after their 3-0 start. Because once people started to recalibrate those expectations, this team wasn't able to handle it. And I also feel like this team, to a degree, they didn't really have a great job of being humble. You know, before they played Oregon, they were dancing and stomping and disrespecting Oregon in the middle of the field pre-game before that game kicked off. And that really set off Oregon. And when Dan Lanning said that we're going to talk with our pads, that pretty much was a clear indicator of how Colorado at times, they're not focused. They weren't locked in. And that's my biggest, that's my biggest criticism of Deion Sanders and how he's handled this team his first season. All right, you can say they won 4 games. It's a huge accomplishment. It's a success. Yes, it is. But let's not also deny the fact that more could have been done. They should have beaten Stanford. You didn't have to get embarrassed by Oregon in that way if your players were a little bit more ready to play. The fact that you're stomping on Oregon's logo and dancing on it, that's disrespectful. That shows that you weren't completely focused on that game. I do feel like the media attention and the publicity started to get to some of these players' heads. They kind of started to get a little bit egotistical, and same thing with Deion Sanders. The fact that he didn't make the necessary personnel changes until late into the season, I think that's ego. Kamani McLean, we would have loved to see him out there a little bit earlier. Deion was right about that. But not playing that true freshman wide receiver, I think his name is Amarian Miller or Mitchell. Don't quote me on that. Number 14. He only played in that USC game in the second half, and he was going off. And after that, we've rarely seen him play. That's ego. You should be having him on the field a lot more. The fact that they refused to run the football more than 10 times in the first half, that's ego. The fact that he went from Sean Lewis to Pat Shurmur, that's kind of ego, because I never felt like Sean Lewis was the problem. The problem is that you're asking this guy to run an offense that's tailored around Shedeur Sanders storing the football when you don't have the kind of team to sustain that style of offense. When you're going air raid and you're throwing the football 40, 30, 60 times a game, that's not playing complimentary football, because you got to be able to be balanced. You at least have to be able to make the defense at least think about you running the ball potentially. But Colorado, the fact that they were one-dimensional in offense and this defense didn't really play that great for the majority of this year, there's a lot of things that Deion Sanders has to work on. His clock management is awful. There hasn't really been too many bust games I've watched this year when Colorado has had all 3 of their timeouts in the full quarter, because most of the times they're using them on situations that don't even involve them needing a timeout. Having too many men on the field in certain occasions, having too many self-inflicted penalties on themselves. This team wasn't greatly coached. And Deion Sanders isn't a bad coach. He's a okay coach, but he's a coach right now that's still learning. He was a big fish in a small pond when he was coaching at Jackson State. And even when he was in the SWAC, he was dominating the SWAC just because he had a more talented team than the majority of teams that he was going up against. But even then, they lost in the Celebration Bowl. His last game at Jackson State, they got embarrassed in the Celebration Bowl. And a large reason for that was due to coaching. So Deion Sanders, if he's going to be able to sustain that Colorado, he needs to improve as a coach overall, and he kind of needs to look in the mirror and kind of change some things about himself personally. Because you can't coach at Colorado and Power 5 the same way that you were coaching at Jackson State. You were a big fish in a small pond at Jackson State. Now, you're a big fish in a really big pond in NCAA Division I FBS college football. And if you go into the Big 12, you potentially could become a small fish in a big pond if your coaching doesn't step up. Now, I still believe in Deion Sanders, but this loss showed us that the main reason why this team was able to have the amount of success that they did was due to Shedeur Sanders. And Shedeur Sanders, if you didn't view him as one of the best quarterbacks in the game prior to this game, him getting injured and not being on the field should show you just how much he meant to this team and how much he was carrying this team on his back. When he's not in there, this team is arguably the worst team in all of college football. He was the only thing that made this team as good as what they were when they were 4-0, minus Travis Hunter and a couple of other performances from Jimmy Horn Jr. and Xavier Weaver. For the most part, this just was a team that had some really good wide receivers and a really great quarterback, and that was about it. The defense hasn't been there. The offensive line hasn't been good enough to be able to sustain success at this level. You refuse to run the football, and you got really good running backs. Your running backs don't suck. Like, All McCaskill had 16 touchdowns. He was averaging 5 yards per carry his freshman season at Houston. His true freshman season, by the way, and we have rarely seen him this season. There's been a lot of talent this season that has been underutilized by Colorado. And the fact that the in-game adjustments haven't been that great neither. Deion Sanders has a lot to work on as a coach, and Washington State, they laid it on these boys. Cameron Ward, this dude is a really great quarterback. And I'm really surprised that Washington State has had the kind of season that they've had. You would have thought that they would have at least been a little bit better than what they've been up to this point. But Colorado, man, it's like, yeah, you can clap your hands and we're going to celebrate Deion Sanders winning 4 games. And this does kind of look like a successful season. But it just feels as if Coach Prime and the Buffs left a little bit more on the table. They left a couple of plates that they could have ate or they could have gave away. That Stanford game, you never should have lost that game. That should have been a win, okay? And even that game against USC, you probably could have had a chance at winning that game if you had better clock management. But Deion Sanders, he's not the perfect coach that me and a lot of people thought that he was when he was coming into this thing. We thought that the only thing keeping Colorado back from success was going to be the fact that he didn't have all the dogs that he needed to compete at this level and to be able to be a championship team, but to even be a bowl eligible team. It wasn't just all about talent. A lot of these games that Colorado has lost down the stretch has mainly been due in part to poor coaching. And the coaching needs to step it up, and the recruiting even needs to step it up. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on this week. But Washington State, they embarrassed Colorado 56-14. Shedeur Sanders got injured. This team, we saw in this blowout loss how much Shedeur meant to this Buffs team this season and how big of a factor he had in their wins, because when he's not on the field, they're one of the worst teams in the nation.